Popular memory of the American Revolution centers on sudden, dramatic flashpoints, tea tossed into Boston Harbor, a civilian uprising in the streets, or a spontaneous burst of anger over a single tax on paper. Behind these events lay a far slower, more systemic reality. By the time the first shots were fired, the British colonial system had spent decades fracturing as the interests of the London metropolis and the American periphery drifted in opposite directions. Understanding 1776 requires looking past the battlefield to analyze the deep structural divergences that eventually made the British colonial system unable to maintain its own internal logic. This breakdown occurred across three specific vectors. Every 18th century colonial system relied on a specific political, sociocultural, and economic alignment to maintain control over its distant territories. Within the UPSC framework, historical revolutions are assessed through these interacting structures. We must examine how shifts in the state, the society, and the economy converge to destabilize the status quo. The ensuing war grew from a breakdown in imperial architecture, a moment where the system could no longer bridge the widening gap between its core in London and its edge in the colonies. The baseline political architecture of the British Empire circa 1750 rested on parliamentary sovereignty. Under this doctrine, the British legislature in London claimed absolute, unilateral authority over every colony in the Atlantic. Geography immediately challenged that authority. A transatlantic voyage took months, meaning instructions from London often arrived after the local situation had already changed. Daily governance from across an ocean was physically impossible. London couldn't manage daily affairs, so colonies developed localized infrastructure. Assemblies like the House of Burgesses filled the vacuum. Over generations, they functioned as independent governments, raising taxes and passing local laws, creating permanent friction with London's assumption of control. Initially, the colonists did not seek a break from the empire. They sought the same rights of direct political representation that were already enjoyed by British citizens living in the metropole. The political setup fractured because Britain attempted to enforce absolute sovereignty over a periphery that had already developed functional, autonomous self-governance. Physical distance also drove a demographic shift. By the mid-18th century, generations of colonists had been born and raised in America without ever experiencing life in Britain. These network graphs show the societal contrast. 18th century Britain was a rigid aristocratic pyramid. The American colonies were a decentralized web. Abundant land allowed rapid social mobility and the acquisition of property impossible within the British class system. This social fluidity was accelerated by two intellectual catalysts, the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening. These movements promoted individualism and taught colonists to evaluate authorities based on reason and mutual contract rather than inherited status. This combination of social mobility and Enlightenment philosophy steadily eroded cultural deference to the British Crown. Colonists increasingly viewed themselves as culturally distinct and equal citizens rather than subordinate subjects of a distant capital. Conflict became a reality of the system once a rigid, aristocratic empire attempted to dictate terms to a rapidly expanding, socially fluid colonial population that no longer viewed the metropole as its cultural superior. The final structural pillar was the economic model of the era, mercantilism. This diagram illustrates mercantilism. Colonies provided cheap raw materials to Britain and served as a captive market for manufactured goods. During decades of salutary neglect, these laws went unenforced, allowing the colonial economy to diversify into a profitable system. This period of growth was interrupted by the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763. While Britain emerged victorious, it was burdened with a massive war debt. To service that debt, Parliament ended salutary neglect and shifted to a policy of aggressive economic extraction, enforcing trade monopolies and levying new direct taxes. This 1765 document shows that extraction. Note the repeating 1 penny red stamps. Under the Stamp Act, these were required on printed materials, allowing Parliament to bypass local assemblies and project economic policy directly into colonists' daily lives. The economic setup reached its breaking point when Britain attempted to extract wealth from a mature colonial economy that had already tasted functional independence. Bringing these factors together reveals a systemic chain reaction. Economic extraction violated long-standing political self-governance, and the resulting resistance was fueled by a socio-cultural identity built on individualism. Under this combined pressure, the three pillars of the colonial system fractured. The war occurred because the mercantilist model required rigid extraction, while the political and socio-cultural models had already developed the autonomy and distinct identity required to resist it. The American Revolution was the point where the metropole's demands and the periphery's development reached a state of total systemic friction. When analyzing imperial collapse, look beyond individual grievances. Examine the fundamental convergence of state architecture, societal evolution, and economic policy to see how the foundations of an empire give way. The birth of the United States was the structural shattering of the old mercantilist world order.